Okay, so I was asked to make a video that switches from a walk animation to a climb animation when someone jumps onto a ledge. With more lead time, I could have made a better animation. This is not meant to be artistic. This is purely meant to be functional as far as showing how to switch from one animation to another, because there's basically two things you're doing to make this work. So say your character is jumping and they grab onto a ledge. So you have to detect the collision. You have to be able to then stop any velocity because they're holding onto the ledge, and then you have to switch animation, and then when the animation completes, you then have to reposition them so they're standing on top of the ledge and back into their default or walking or idle animation. So far all I've done, you can see it's an empty scene, and at the top there's just a camera in the scene, and all these images are simply the two walk cycles. Well, excuse me, the walk cycle and the climb cycle. So first thing I'm going to do is going to create an empty object, and we'll just call this Stickman. Click on Stickman, go to Animation, and what we're going to do is we're going to add a curve. Okay, so create new clip, and this clip we'll just call it walk. In a real game, you'd probably have multiple animations. You'd have like an idle animation when they're just standing there, a walk animation, maybe a separate run animation when they're moving faster, as well as the climb animation. So we're kind of shortening that, only having two animations. So the idle and the walk will be the same. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we simply grab the ones for the walk animation, which starts here, ends here. Just drag and drop those up there. Let's drop the rate down to say 12 frames per second, and then we just have to repeat some of these frames so that it cycles. Okay. See if that looks. When you click on the frame, you can see over here to the right in the inspector which one it is in case you lose track. So 01, 02, 03, 04, 05. Those should be fine since I dragged them as a group. 06, 05, 04, 03, 02. Perfect. And then since it cycles, you already have 01 there. So now what we're going to do is we're going to add another clip, and this one will be called Climb. Similarly, we'll take the corresponding images. Oops, I actually got one more in there that I missed. And we'll put them up there. And again, drop the rate. Probably slower than what you'd actually use, but this way you can actually clearly see that the animation is playing. Now, since this is a climb animation, a one-off, basically they're lifting themselves up by their arms and they're swinging their legs up, you don't want to cycle. You want to have this run through once and only. Now, if they're saying climbing up a ladder, left, right, repeatedly going straight up a ladder, then that would be a cycle. But in this case, you don't want it to cycle. You want it to go through just once, because it's just them swinging their legs up and getting onto the ledge. So we have our character. Let's go to animator. So this basically gives you a visual representation of all the animations. So basically each block is just an animation cycle, and the orange one is the default one. So if I was to click on this, right click and choose set default, then the climb animation will just keep happening. See? Okay, so what we want is we'll put the walk animation back to default, and what we're going to do is we're going to create what's known as a transition. So we're going to right click, make transition. That gives you an arrow. Just point on the one that you want, and then right click on that one, make transition, and we'll go back to the walk cycle. Because as you saw, if you don't tell it to do this, it's only going to use the default animation. Now down here are conditions that you could create as far as controlling when this happens. So click on the plus sign and we'll click on trigger, and we'll call it climb now. And then what we'll do is we'll click on the arrow that's going from walk to climb. Right now it does it based on time. What we want to do is we want to base it on that trigger. There's no condition to the right of it because the trigger is simply yes or no. It is or it isn't. So that's why there's no conditions there. Click on the arrow from climb to walk, and we can leave it as exit time. That basically when the animation finishes, it automatically goes back into walk. So the key is making this be true, triggering that trigger. So let's go back to our scene, and what's going to happen is we need to have a key to make them jump, or we can just have them jump on their own. Either way, it needs a script. So let's go to add component, new script. We'll just call it jump script. Create an add. So open that up. And actually, let's do one more thing. Let's do add component, physics 2D, and we will do box collider. Set it as a trigger. And give it a 1 by 1 shape for the moment. And we will add, so this is obviously based on the name for collisions. Still think as to whether or not, we'll use it as a trigger for the moment. We'll see how that works. Physics 2D, actually, we'll have it not be a trigger. That way they don't fall through the floor and things like that. So add component, physics 2D, and we need a rigid body 2D. That way it's affected by gravity. We don't have to make any changes. The defaults are fine. So if I run this now, you'll see them dropping. Okay, so that's good. So what we're going to do is at start, rather than putting in a key code, we'll just simplify it a little bit by having them automatically jump. So they're going to have get component, rigid body 2D, so that's what we just added. We're going to change the velocity, and it's a new vector 3, and we want them to be moving vertically, so let's have them and horizontally. So we'll do the horizontal 3, vertical 4, depth of 0, and then we'll just run this so you can see that it makes them jump by default, and then gravity brings them back down. So a couple of things. Let's first move them beneath the midpoint, that way we've got some more room to play with. And we're going to have to make them jump much more than that. So have them jump 8. And have them jump 4. Much better. Okay, so now we're going to drag in an image to represent the cliff. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into one of my other folders. We'll use this one. So we're going to use this twice. One for what they're standing on to begin with. So we need to add box collider, but we don't need to give it any gravity, so we don't need to give it a rigid body. Just make that a little bit wider. Okay. And as you can see, physics are taking effect. It automatically bounced on its own, so that's great. Now we're going to add another meter. And this is going to be what you're going to jump onto. Couple things. For the stickman, we're going to edit the box collider, that way it goes down more towards his feet. And actually, so it's easier to see him, we're going to also add a sprite, a default sprite. So let's click on our stickman, and you can just grab whichever one you want. Make a sprite. There we go, now we can see him. So edit that box collider off to the side. Now I'm going to create one more ledge. Just going to scale some of this so as that the jumping works better. That looks pretty good. So what we're going to do now is now we have to detect the collision. So void, so this is outside of start and outside of update, void on collision enter 2D collision 2D, and other will represent whatever it is that you're hitting. That way we can check what we're hitting. We'll call this one, we'll rename it ledge, since that's the one we have to jump onto. And what we're going to do is, so this is saying a collision has occurred with another object. So if a collision has occurred, let's check something. We're going to say if others, because we said other is going to represent what's being collided with, dot aim object dot name equals, we called it ledge, more brackets, and as always we'll just check the debug log first to make sure I didn't make any mistakes. Might have to tweak the trajectory. Do impact with ledge. And actually we're pretty close to being done. Once we impact with the ledge, we just have to set the trigger that we set up a few minutes ago in the animation to swap out which animation is being used. Okay. As you can see down here, it does say impact with ledge. So what we're going to do now, we can get rid of that since we know the impact works. And we're going to now do velocity. Oops. So get component. 2D dot velocity equals new vector 3 0 0 0. So that should stop them from moving. Okay, good. So now they hit the wall and then they bounce off. We want them to actually grapple. Okay, so setting the velocity is the first thing. The other thing that you have to do is you have to temporarily get rid not the rigid body, sorry. It is the, yeah, it is the rigid body. Rigid body 2D, and we want to change the scale. Gravity scale is going to be 0 because when we added the rigid body 2D, gravity scale defaults to 1. That's what makes them go back down to the ground. So when it impacts, it'll now no longer have a gravity scale. It'll hang in midair. Okay, that we need to just change with this fixed angle. Excellent. So now they're grappling. Now we just need them to go through the animation to swing over. So we now have to say, so what we have to do is we have to create a variable because, and this is one of the kind of redundant things about Unity, I'm not quite sure why it does this, even though the animation is attached, you still have to give it a variable. So we'll just set this up as public animator. Just call it anim. Save that, and the new variable appears there. Okay, so now anim the stickman animator. And what we do anim dot set trigger, and we give it the name that we used here, climb now. I believe case matters. I haven't tried recently, but very often case is important. It's case sensitive. And there we go, and they climbed up. So almost there. And as you notice, once it was done climbing up, it then automatically went back into the previous animation because of this right here. We simply said exit time. So once it completes, it automatically goes back. You don't have to set another trigger. You already set the exit time. So little housekeeping, we'll put this one on top. We'll put it order in layer 1. And the other thing that we have to do is when it's done climbing, we then have to bump its position up into the new location. So you can either do this based on time, or you can create a your own subroutine. So that would look like this. So outside of the on collision, outside of update, outside of start, we have void and whatever you want to call it. We'll call it back to idle, because it's going back to the idle animation. Oops. Sorry, I put it outside of the whole thing. You don't want that. It still needs to be within this. I'd put it outside of even the public class, so. And this is just so we really need to capture the position before we do that. So public vector 3, and we'll call it climb POS. So what we do is when this occurs, we'll simply transfer that position into that. So climb POS equals get component transform, since we're looking at locations, dot position. So often you see me do the right half here, get component, transform, position, and then I change it. In this case, we're not changing it, we're simply taking that and dumping it into this variable. And then you'll see why. Because you have to adjust the position up and over. So there's that they're up on the ledge. So, and this will just be about the last thing to do. So get component, transform, and this is what I was just saying about usually when I do this, you see me change the position. Okay, equals new vector 3. Let's see if we can do it this way. So climb position dot x, and we're going to push it over 1 because it moved to the right. Climb position dot y plus 1 because it moved up. We're not doing anything with z. So when a script is attached to an object, sorry, I had an extra script open there. So a script is attached to an object, that object has an animation, you can access those animations. So if you click on this here, add event, function, see, that's what we just created, back to idle. Close that, and there's a little marker, we'll just move it to here. In other words, what this is saying is when we've gotten to the last frame, that what we want it to do is we want it to perform that function, and that function is to reposition the object, and that should just about do it, I believe. Okay, not quite. So, looks like that didn't quite work. There we go. Alright, so a little bit rougher on the edges, but if you have any questions, just let me know. The way I drew the animation, it probably makes more sense if they're jumping straight up. Jumping to the side like that, you probably need more of a profile, but it's easy enough. Functionally it works, it's just a matter of graphically changing the animation so it looks like that they're pulling themselves up as far as a profile rather than from behind. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask.